I want to pick up another brilliant message from uh, Robert Atkins, who says, I hope you weren't referring obliquely to me when you were talking about Kremlin propagandists who speak very good English. I am, in fact, as English as you are. Well, some Scottish, too. I can't speak Russian. I've never been to Russia. I don't know a single Russian person. What I do have is something as British as can be, and it's called the British sense of fair play. You hardly hear that expression nowadays, but I heard it quite a bit when I was growing up in Essex. Yes, I'm an Essex boy. And I've never been able to get it out of my head. Even though as time goes by, I wonder if it was ever anything more than a naive delusion. I hope not, Robert. It is in that name, in the name of the British sense of fair play, that I stick up for and defend Russia, as you should. We should all defend Russia if we can. The point is that I'm not sure that we can at this moment. I have great affection for Russia, and I try in my posts to draw a distinction between the Russia I know and the Russians I know and the Kremlin, run by Putin and his cronies, some of whom I've met, and those meetings sent a shiver through my spine even then, back in 2015, 2016, whatever it was. And I was meeting high-ranking Russians until I left the country in 2019. I haven't been back, so yeah. And he says, we, the collective West, are the aggressors, and to make the point, he puts it in capital letters. Russia is not the aggressor here. We, the collective West, are. We wanted this conflict, and we provoked this conflict thinking that the unprecedented sanctions that we imposed in early 2022 would turn the ruble to rubble and would initiate the overthrow of the government by the Russian people, and thinking also that our superior weaponry would lead to inevitable victory. I'm afraid this needs to be challenged. And this post raises several points that deviate from factual accuracy in the larger context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the international response. The statement that Russia is not the aggressor is a fundamental mischaracterization of the situation. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the subsequent full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, are clear violations, both are clear violations of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. I remember very clearly in 2014 in my university, going to see the rector in his office, and outside the rector's office was this beautiful relief map, and he'd had it repainted so that Crimea was then part of the area that was marked as Russian, and the entire map had been repainted to accommodate Crimea in a very short space of time. I think it was a matter of a week or so. And I was a bit shocked by the suddenness and the acquisitive nature, the sort of statement. And it was a huge map. It covered the wall. It was a very beautiful and impressive piece of artistry. The UN Charter, to which both Russia and the West are signatories, prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state. And Ukraine became independent and ceded its nuclear arsenal to Moscow on the condition that Moscow would act as its protector, and it hasn't. So there are two reasons why this was so unconscionable. And Russia's actions in Ukraine, starting with Crimea, ending with the invasion of Donetsk, Luhansk, and the further parts of the country, are clear-cut examples of aggression. And to suggest that the West provoked Russia undermines the fact that Ukraine is a sovereign state with its own right to self-determination, and the West's involvement in supporting Ukraine is a response to Russian aggression, not a catalyst for it. And the portrayal of sanctions as a form of aggression ignores that they are a non-violent tool aimed at curbing unlawful behavior rather than inciting conflict. International sanctions are employed as a means of holding aggressor states accountable for breaches of international law without resorting to military action, without direct military action. For the record, I don't believe sanctions work. and I don't believe sanctions target the people who are responsible for the misdemeanors. But that, of course, means that we are in a perfect position to negotiate directly with Russia about the intensification or the reduction of sanctions in response to the aggression of Russia against a sovereign territory. So the notion that the collective West are the aggressors echoes Kremlin rhetoric that seeks to blame NATO's eastward expansion as the reason for their conflict, and the argument overlooks key facts. One, Ukraine is not a NATO member, though it has expressed an interest in joining. Two, NATO's expansion eastward came at the request of former Soviet states, not as an imposition by the West. These states sought NATO protection to safeguard their sovereignty against potential Russian aggression, which they saw developing. Three, Russia has frequently manipulated historical grievances and security concerns to justify aggressive actions, but this doesn't make them legitimate or defensible. So the West's actions, sanctions, military support for Ukraine, and diplomatic efforts are reactions to Russian expansionism, not the initiation of hostilities. And the statement that the West's sanctions aim to turn the ruble to rubble, lovely alliteration, or instigate the overthrow of the Russian government is overly simplistic and reductive. Sanctions are not designed to collapse an economy overnight or immediately provoke regime change. Rather, they serve as a long-term strategy, and again, there are three reasons. One, to weaken Russia's ability to fund its military operations. Two, to isolate Russia from the global financial system. And three, to pressure the Kremlin to negotiate or cease its illegal actions. And Russia's initial ability to adapt to the sanctions, largely through energy exports and alternative trade routes, doesn't mean that the sanctions have failed. The long-term impact on Russia's technological sectors, defense industries, and overall economic plans for growth will continue to unfold. And the cumulative impact of economic isolation has already led to inflation, loss of international investors, and a stagnation of technological advancements. My concern about sanctions is that it targets and it hurts ordinary people, and our concerns should be with ordinary people. Our punishment should be directed against the people in the Kremlin, and those targeted sanctions, that second form of sanctions, I think doesn't target clearly enough. Sanctions are a little bit like chemotherapy. They're a little bit of a blunt tool, and the fallout from that is enormous. The argument made under the banner of British sense of fair play presupposes a false moral equivalence between Russia and the West. And supporting Russia in this context ignores the documented war crimes, including the bombing of civilians, the atrocities in places like Bucha, the appalling treatment of Melitopol, the widespread use of force, the chemical weapons to subdue a sovereign nation. And the Post implicitly assumes that Western involvement is driven by a desire for military dominance. What complete rot! This ignores the genuine security and the moral interests at stake. The aim is not to defeat Russia for the sake of power projection, but to defend a democratic state and uphold international norms. Both Russia and NATO indeed claim to have superior weapons. You're quite right, such as Russia's Poseidon missile or NATO's Patriot missile defense system. However, the superiority of weapons is not the core issue here. Advanced weaponry is present on both sides, but this does not justify the war itself or the violation of a nation's sovereignty. More importantly, the success or failure of specific technologies does not change the fundamental moral dimension of the conflict. The focus on military hardware risks diverting attention away from the real issue, Russia's attempt to redraw the borders of Europe through brute force and aggression. And the claim that we miscalculated, oh, come on. It implies the West sought to provoke Russia, to provoke a Russian collapse, to provoke a deterioration of the regime or military defeat. This analysis overlooks Russia's own strategic, its own miscalculations. Moscow underestimated Ukraine's resistance. its unity in the face of aggression, and the West's capacity to deliver coordinated economic military aid. The Russian government overestimated its ability to quickly overthrow Kyiv and install a puppet regime. And before you say that, Boris talked Zelensky out of the peace talks. No, what talked Zelensky out of the peace talks was the atrocity in Bucha. And we shouldn't underestimate the resolve of the Ukrainian people, or indeed of the international community, to respond to the Kremlin aggression. The West's support for Ukraine is not an act of aggression. It's an act of defense, defending international law, defending sovereignty, defending the principle that borders should not be changed by force, and sanctions, military aid, diplomatic isolation of Russia are proportional and justified responses to Russia's illegal war, even if I don't agree with all those responses. The argument for fair play should be applied to Ukraine, not to Russia, which has every right. Ukraine has every right to defend itself against a much larger power seeking to dismantle its statehood, to emasculate it. This conflict is not a testbed for weapons. It's not some sort of chess game, but a struggle for the survival of a sovereign nation. And framing the West's response as aggression or overreach misinterprets the values at the heart of international diplomacy and peacekeeping efforts. Would you have said the same thing about the British decision to go to war to defend Poland in 1939? Would you have said the same thing then? Would you have said the same thing? Would you have been so mealy-mouthed in the run-up to D-Day? Or in the celebration of the soldiers coming home after Dunkirk? You talk about British fair play, but you don't demonstrate it. The true aggressor here remains Russia. This is one of the few wars in the last 70 years that can be represented very clearly as a contrast, a contest between good and evil. And yes, there will be failings on the Ukrainian side, and yes, there will be goodness on the Russian side, because many of the people who are in the Russian fight are good people. But many of them are blackguards and villains, criminals and thugs. And if you want to know who are the Nazis, it's the ones wearing the Nazi uniform and parading under a Nazi name, the Nazi composer Wagner. I'm a great Wagner fan, but I would never think of naming a troop of soldiers the Wagner Brigade. If I thought somebody was, if I was reluctant for that brigade to be identified as Nazi, there's only one Nazi group in this contest, and that's in Russia, and that's with these brigades, and there's plenty of them. The Wagner Brigade was not the only one, and the aggressors are Russia. Be in no doubt about that at all, please. Be in no doubt.